We're supposed to be getting 3 new cameras this year. Well, actually, one is a completely new model, whereas the other 2 are refreshes of existing ones. This according to Sony Alpha Rumors. Now, the first one I want to address is the rumored brand new model. What I think this is going to be is the A5, a camera that's going to compete with Canon's RP as well as the RP replacement. Right now, Canon has the market on low-price entry-level full-frame mirrorless cameras at around $899 to $999 for the RP, depending on when it goes on sale. And of course, the rumored RP replacement is supposed to be announced sometime in the first half and cost $899. So the A5 makes perfect sense. Sony has an awful lot of cameras in their lineup, more than many others. And there is a little bit of overcrowding at the top end, but the bottom end, there's certainly a placeholder, and the A5 makes sense. At this point, I don't want to get into the specs too much because the A5 isn't the, well, it's not the big news of today. It's the cameras that we're getting refreshes of. The A9 Mark II as well as the A7R V were both announced and released in October of 2019, and that's just a couple of years ago. Now, when we come to the second half of this year, when their successors are supposed to be announced, that will mark the 3-year mark. Now, for Sony, well, they're all over the place. They can release updates anywhere from a year to 5 years, so we'll just have to wait and see if we are getting a refresh of these 2 cameras. But according to Sony Alpha Rumors, the A9 Mark III will be coming out in the second half, as well as the A7R V. Let's first talk about the Alpha 9. The A9 Mark II made an awful lot of sense when it came out in 2019 for a price of $44.98. It had a 24.2 megapixel sensor, it was capable of 20 frames per second, and could produce video at 4K up to 30 frames per second. And looking at the landscape back then, we didn't have the R5, the R3, the Z9, the Alpha 1. We didn't even have the 1DX Mark III. And if you look at the 1DX Mark II, Canon's DSLR, but their flagship camera, their flagship DSLR, well, it could only shoot up to 16 frames per second. So the Sony A9 beat it. In terms of video, sure, the Canon edged it out with 4K 60, but it had that old motion JPEG, which took up an awful lot of space. And in terms of sensor size, well, Canon's 1DX Mark II had a 21.2 megapixel sensor. So while the A9 Mark II cost around $4,500, it beat out the Canon flagship DSLR, which was selling for about $2,000 more. And even when Canon announced the 1DX Mark III a few months later in January, well, the A9 Mark II still beat it out in many areas. Now, looking at my list here, what do we have for the 1DX Mark II? Yeah, 21.2 megapixel sensor, 16 frames per second, and it could do 4K 60. Now, the 1DX Mark III did bump up the video to 5.5K RAW and 20 frames per second on the still side. But still, when you looked at the Alpha 9 for what it could deliver and its price, it was very attractive, and this was the game that Sony was playing back then. Let's put out really amazing cameras, the A9, the A7, and let's put it in much lower than the competition, like the A7 III. It was about $500 cheaper than anything else out in its category. They since corrected that with the A7 IV. It is now priced about the same as the competition, within plus or minus $1 or $2. So here we are in 2022. The camera landscape is very different. Canon has caught up in many areas in many segments. And we've got the Nikon Z9, which can do 8K up to 60 frames per second, Apple ProRes 422 as a codec for $5,500. Then with Canon at $3,800, we have the R5 that can do 8K RAW video up to 30 frames per second, 20 frames per second stills, and it's got a whopping 45 megapixel sensor, the same as the Z9. And of course, the Alpha 1. And this is where I'm having problems with the A9. Look at the Alpha 1, 8K video, long op. It can do 50 frames per second, not 50 frames per second, it's got a 50 megapixel sensor and can do 30 frames per second. So this is where I have problems with the A9 III. What is the A9 III going to do? Is it going to be a major update to catch up to the competition? And if it does catch up to the competition, isn't it going to eat the Alpha 1's lunch? Now, sure, the Alpha 1 has a slightly faster, or has a faster buffer speed. But if they catch up to the competition, I'm not talking about beat the competition. Let's just say they match the R5, which has 8K video up to 30 frames per second. Let's say they put a 30-minute record limit on it. and give it 20 frames per second. Well, that gets very, very close to the Alpha 1. And yes, the Alpha 1 does have a faster buffer speed, but still, to be able to bring a lot of those capabilities down to the same price, well, that's what Sony was doing with the A9 in terms of Canon's flagship camera. They said, look, we have all these capabilities. Sure, the 1DX is a little bit faster in some areas, but hey, you're saving $2,000. And if we look at the newly announced R5C, which can do 8K 60 unlimited recording and still have a 45 megapixel sensor, I'm really curious about the A9 Mark III. I really don't know where to place this camera. Does it even make sense anymore? Because when they refresh the Alpha 1, it's not going to be for a few years. It was just announced last year in January, and we didn't start getting those shipped till about a month or two later. So the A9 Mark III, I'm really confused as to what to do with this camera, because even the high-speed cameras of the past, with the exception of the R3, are now going to 45 megapixels or more. The Z9, 45, the Alpha 1, 50 megapixels. I'm really unsure. And what do you think? What do you think the specs are going to be of the A9 Mark III if it does come out in the second half? And how do you think Sony's going to place it with the A9? Sorry, not the A9, the Alpha 1. And I just really have no idea. I'm having trouble trying to figure out, does an A9 Mark III belong in Sony's lineup anymore? To me, the A7R IV makes an awful lot more sense. It was released at the same time, October 2019, for a price of $3,500 or $3,498 to be precise. And while it only had 10 frames per second, it offered a whopping 61 megapixel sensor. This was a high megapixel camera. And this makes sense because nothing else that Sony offered at the time, or Canon, or even Nikon, provided anything close to 61 megapixels. And it's only Panasonic's S series, the S1R, well, that even came close to touching it. And of course, they use their not quad pixel autofocus, pixel shift. See, multiply by 4, my brain mixes things up. But that pixel shift technology allowed them to shoot well past that. And we're not going to get into the issues of pixel shifting. That's not the point of this video. So what could the update to the A7R IV be, the A7R V? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if the successor has 102 or 100 megapixel sensor. And why do I say this? So as you can see clearly here, Sony has a sensor out there, and they could easily put this in the A7R V and offer a 100 megapixel high megapixel camera. And it would make perfect sense. And the price, well, they could charge almost whatever they want because nobody else on the market has one. They could charge $3,500, which I can guarantee you they're not. I would at least add 2% per year, and that would be your minimum base price that this camera is going to cost. And based on Sony's pricing of the A7 IV, which is about $600 or $500 over the A7 III, Sony's now come to the conclusion that their cameras are worth what they are, and they don't have to discount them anymore. So I don't expect the A7R V to come in anything less than around $38 or $39.99, and this camera certainly makes sense, and I could see that come this fall. I also know that Canon is working on their own 100 plus megapixel sensor as well, and Sony's probably well aware of that, so the time to come out with one would be this year. Now, whether Canon's coming out one with this year or not, we just don't know. It was rumored to come out last year. They were going to come out with a high megapixel version of the R5. And they've done this before with the 5D RS. So Sony knows about that. They know they have to hit around 100 megapixels, and that's where I think this will be. Now, in terms of frames per second, I think that the current 10 frames per second is more than acceptable when dealing high frame rates like this. Or sorry, not high frame rates, with a high megapixel sensor, and it makes an awful lot of sense. So on the Sony side, the second half of this year, according to Sony Alpha rumors, we're going to be getting the A7R V, a high megapixel camera. Makes a lot of sense. We're also supposed to be, and again, these are rumors, so this isn't 100%. We're supposed to be getting the A9 Mark III, and that camera, to me, I'm really having trouble trying to figure out what capabilities it should have. And right now in 4K, it only has UHD. It doesn't have DCI. That could be a one cripple factor that the A9 III has. But what do you think? Do you think that Sony's a little overcrowded in the top end, and do you think there's still a space for the A9 III? Remember, the Alpha 1 was just released last year. We're unlikely to get an update on that camera for at least 2 more years. And now let's take one last look at the A5. As I talked about at the beginning of this video, the A5 has been rumored for quite some time now, and it makes an awful lot of sense because if you look at the low end of the market in full frame, Sony doesn't have anything that really competes with Canon's EOS RP, which is $899 to $999, $999 being the regular price, but quite often we see it go on sale for $899. And the rumors are that Canon this year, probably within the first half, is going to release a successor to that camera with a retail price of $899. Now it's likely to not have an EVF, but have it as an option, which will cost more. But still, this is a part in Sony's lineup that place in Sony's lineup that Sony is missing. Whereas Canon, pretty well anything up to the R6, Canon's lineup has a lot of holes in it. And I think the A5 is going to help fill that hole. It makes an awful lot of sense. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. What do you think they're going to give the A5? I really don't think it's going to go much above 4K, 4K 30. I think it's going to have some issues with rolling shutter in terms of frame rates. I think 10 or 12 frames per second max makes sense. Have decent dynamic range. And well, it's a Sony camera. It's going to produce really, really good results. And I think it's going to compete with cameras that are very similar in that price range. You just have to look at the Canon EOS RP. But remember, that is a really old camera. And even when it came out in 2019, it was based off the 5D Mark IV technology, so I'd even expect Canon to jump that up a little bit. But if you want something that's relatively modern in terms of Canon, look at their 90D. I know it's DSLR, but still, those are the sorts of capabilities you might expect to find in an A5 or the EOS RP replacement. Oh, one last thing I almost forgot to mention. The rumors of the new camera, which I'm thinking could be the A5, according to Sony Alpha rumors, it's coming from 3 separate sources. So it definitely looks like a new camera is coming out there. I really do think it's going to be the A5. And regardless of whether it's called the A5, I think it's definitely going to come out to compete with the Canon EOS RP and the RP replacement. And please don't forget to subscribe and like. Your subscribes, I take them as a virtual pat on the back. And while they do help this channel grow, nothing helps this channel grow more than you watching my videos and recommending them to others. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.